the lost years. Many have the mistaken impression that our New Testament Gospels offer us 4 fairly complete biographies of Jesus' life. The facts are otherwise. Mark begins his story with Jesus at age 30. By chapter 8, more than halfway through his 16 chapters, he has already come to the final weeks of Jesus' life. Matthew and Luke add birth stories, and they include more of the teachings of Jesus, but basically they follow Mark's lead, devoting over half their accounts to Jesus' final journey to Jerusalem where he is crucified. John begins with Jesus at 30, and he likewise devotes half his book to Jesus' final days in Jerusalem. We do have other writings that have survived outside the New Testament, often called infancy gospels, serving more to entertain and mythologize than to inform. For example, in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is not the same as the more authentic Gospel of Thomas, we read that when Jesus was 5 years old, he formed 12 sparrows out of mud on the Sabbath. His father Joseph reprimanded him for playing in this fashion on the holy day of rest, and Jesus clapped his hands, and his clay birds were instantly transformed to life and flew away. On another occasion, when Jesus was walking through the crowded streets of his village, another child bumped against his shoulder, and Jesus declared in exasperation, "You shall go no further." The offending child instantly fell dead. Once when a child fell off a roof and died, Jesus was accused of pushing him, so he leaped down and promptly raised him from the dead. As he grew up, he worked with Joseph as a carpenter, and if a piece of wood was accidentally cut too short, he would just stretch it to its proper size with a pull of his hand. The notion that Jesus traveled to Egypt as a young man in order to learn magical powers is a theme common in later Jewish polemics against the Christians. There are legends that Jesus went to India as a child to study with Hindu teachers, amazing them with his precocious knowledge. Perhaps the most fantastic are the tales of Jesus traveling as a boy with Joseph of Arimathea to Great Britain. According to these legends, Joseph, said to be an uncle of Mary, was a tin merchant and made regular trading trips to Cornwall. The town of Glastonbury in southwest England on the island of Avalon, where King Arthur was buried, still celebrates this tradition today and has become a popular pilgrimage center. Historians give such legendary material little credibility. Surprisingly, however, there is much we can responsibly determine about these lost years. By skillfully combining the archaeological evidence with what we know from contemporary historical records, and being guided by some tantalizing hints in the Gospels themselves, we can begin to fill in some of the blanks. 2 young doves. We know that Jesus and his family grew up poor. Luke gives a shocking indication of just how poor. According to Jewish law, every firstborn male child was ritually accepted into the Jewish community through an ancient ceremony called redemption of the son. God had declared in the book of Numbers, "Every firstborn among the Israelites, man as well as beast, is mine." Rather than sacrifice the child to the deity, as was practiced in some ancient cultures, the parents paid the priests 5 silver shekels as part of a ceremony that freed the child from death. This ceremony was carried out 30 days following the birth of the child. On the 40th day, there was another obligation for the mother of any male child, firstborn or not. The child was brought to the temple sanctuary, and the mother was required to give a lamb as a burnt offering and a dove for a sin offering to the officiating priests. In cases of dire poverty, the Torah stipulated further, if she cannot afford a sheep, she shall take 2 doves or 2 pigeons, one for the burnt offering and the other for the sin offering. It is Luke who tells us that Mary and Joseph, as observant Jews, took Jesus up to the Jerusalem temple to fulfill these ritual obligations. There she offered sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. There is no mention of a sheep. They evidently could not afford even such a modest gift. In contrast, Matthew tells quite a different story. He has Mary and Joseph living in a house in Bethlehem, visited by magi from the east, who lavish the newborn child with expensive gifts and pay homage to him as King of the Jews. Mary and Joseph have the means to travel to Egypt, where they stay for a time, fleeing the wrath of Herod the Great, who has murdered every child in Judea under the age of 2. Only after Herod's death do they travel back to Galilee and settle in a town called Nazareth. Matthew does not even appear to realize that the couple is from Nazareth in the first place. We have extraordinarily good historical records for the reign of Herod the Great. It is inconceivable that such a slaughter of the infants would go unrecorded by the Jewish historian Josephus or other contemporary Roman historians. Matthew's account is clearly theological, written to justify later views of Jesus' exalted status. Luke's story rings true. Mary was a teenager pregnant out of wedlock with an illegitimate child. The birth had taken place in a cave-like stable attached to a guest house where animals were sheltered and fed. The newborn infant was swaddled and placed in a feeding trough. Joseph, her fiancé, was with her, and apparently 8 days after the birth, at the circumcision, the child was given the legal name Yeshua bar Yosef, or Jesus, son of Joseph. But the marriage was not consummated until their return to Nazareth. There is no indication that the couple had friends or resources of any kind. According to Jewish law, they were obligated to stay in the Bethlehem-Jerusalem area for a period of 40 days in order to fulfill the Jewish rituals involved with the birth of a firstborn male child. It is possible the cave-like stable was their dwelling during that entire period. To purchase a sheep for the final offering was a relatively modest expense, and surely, if they could have afforded it, they would have. The offering of the 2 doves tells us something vitally important about the beginnings of the Jesus dynasty. The Roman Emperor Augustus had officially given the coveted title King of the Jews to Herod the Great. He was the wealthiest and most influential client king in the Eastern Mediterranean Empire. In contrast, Jesus was born poor and virtually homeless, despite the royal Davidic bloodline he inherited from his mother. And yet, it was this very dynastic bloodline that Herod and his sons so desperately coveted and feared despite their extraordinary wealth and political power. Was Jesus a carpenter? A good trivia question would be, what was Jesus' vocation? Everyone knows he was a carpenter, or at least the son of a carpenter, but the traditional English translation carpenter is misleading. The Greek word tecton is a more generic term referring to a builder. It can include a person who works with wood, but in its first-century Galilean context, it more likely refers to a stone worker. Houses and buildings were built of stone. Wood was used sparingly, mostly for roof beams and doors, since wood was a scarce building material in the rocky terrain of Palestine. Jesus often drew upon images of stone building to illustrate his teachings. In one of his well-known stories, he speaks of the wise man who in building a house digs a deep foundation and lays the solid stone foundation of the building upon bedrock. The quaint image of Jesus working happily alongside his father in the family carpenter shop is a far cry from the harsh, grinding social reality that was a part of day-to-day life in Galilee, where the rich got richer and the growing masses of poor were evident. A tecton, in this context, was something akin to a day laborer who had no land and who took work as he could find it. These itinerant peasants were left to eke out a subsistence existence on 2 or 3 sesterces a day, barely enough to sustain a slave. The life of a day laborer was surely harder than that of an urban slave whose basic needs of food and shelter were provided. In Roman culture, the artisan trades were regarded as akin to slave labor. They were viewed as the toilsome, back-breaking work of the lower classes. Embarrassment regarding Jesus' social status might well be reflected in Mark's reference by the townsfolk where he grew up, as if to say, "Is this not that day laborer we all know? You know, that illegitimate son of Mary?" Matthew reacts to this with a bit of subtle editing. "Is this not the son of the tecton? Is not his mother called Mary?" For Matthew to be a son of a tecton carries less of a stigma. In Matthew's portrayal, Jesus is king from his birth, despite his father's occupation. Mark knows a more original tradition. Once again, we see how Matthew consistently edits Mark, his main source, in a way that reflects later theological views of Jesus' exalted status. A fatherless father. I've already noted that Joseph, husband of Mary, mysteriously disappears from the scene in all our records. If we want to guess what occupied Jesus during his 20s, before he makes his public debut, we can best picture him acting as father and caretaker to his mother and 6 younger siblings. This was surely no easy burden. The family had no inherited land or wealth. Celsus, the 2nd century AD Roman writer, passes on a tradition that Mary earned money as a spinner. We have no way of knowing Mary's livelihood, but it would have surely fallen to Jesus, as the eldest son of this fatherless Jewish family, to act as the primary breadwinner. To support yourself as an artisan peasant in a small village in Roman-occupied Galilee was burden enough. But to support a large family on daily wages was a nigh impossible task. In Matthew, Jesus tells a story about day laborers hired out to work in the vineyard of a landowner for a denarius a day. The workers assembled at dawn in the marketplace of a village and were hired on the spot to labor until dusk. They were paid the agreed amount in the evening. Jesus specifically mentions the burden of the day and the scorching heat. He seems intimately familiar with the lot of the working poor. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, using such peasant labor, began to rebuild Sepphoris as his gleaming capital city following its savage destruction in 4 BC, as punishment for those who participated in the revolts that followed the death of his father, Herod the Great. It was a Jewish city, but over the next decades was thoroughly reshaped in fashionable Roman style to become the ornament of all Galilee. The building trades were surely booming. Sepphoris soon became the economic hub of the dozens of peasant villages, including Nazareth. In fact, Galilee was one of the most densely populated regions of the entire Roman Empire, crisscrossed by major roads and characterized by a booming economy. Jesus spent his lost years growing up just outside this urban Roman capital of Galilee that lay just over the low hills that ring the small village of Nazareth. It is reasonable to suppose that Joseph would have been drawn to the massive building projects in Sepphoris, where he would be able to ply his skills as a stoneworker, and that Jesus would have learned the same trade as he grew into manhood. Inspired by this thought, some of us decided one early afternoon to try walking from our dig site at Sepphoris to Nazareth. It took us about an hour and a half at a moderate pace in the heat of the day. We don't know when Joseph died, but we can imagine that Jesus might well have labored as a stone worker in Sepphoris into his 20s, particularly if he had the responsibility of caring for his family. The second season I excavated at Sepphoris, our team got down about 2 meters below the present surface of the ground and began to uncover a stone wall and floor that we were able to date to the early 1st century AD. The main draw for my students to dig at Sepphoris was its close proximity to Nazareth and the possibility that Jesus labored there in the building trades during his late teens and 20s. Upon being told that the stones we had uncovered belonged to that period, one of my students asked, half in jest, "Dr. Tabor, do you think it's possible that Jesus might have laid these very stones?" Everyone had a good laugh at the unlikelihood of such a possibility, given the vast area that the ancient city occupied. And yet, there was no doubt that uncovering layers of remains from the time of Jesus and trying to imagine the arduous life of a poor Galilean day laborer had given us a new appreciation for the lost years of Jesus. We could not help but wonder what thoughts might have been in the mind of someone destined to declare himself King of the Jews as he toiled at cutting and laying stones in Herod's magnificent capital city. And that brings us to the question, what do we know about Jesus' attitude toward the Roman military occupation of his country and the powerful dynasty of Herod the Great and his family? Was he a militant, a pacifist, or did he consider such worldly matters a thing of indifference? To what degree did he begin to see his bid to be king of Israel as a realistic threat to the powers of Rome?